In the summer of 778, deep within the shadowed valleys of the Pyrenees, the greatest emperor in Europe was about to face his only defeat. The mountain pass of Roncevaux would become a graveyard for Frankish nobility and birth, a legend that would echo through 1,000 years. What began as Charlemagne's grand crusade into Spain ended in betrayal, massacre, and the death of his most beloved knight. This is not just the story of a military disaster. This is the tale of how political ambition, broken promises, and wounded pride conspired to destroy an army and create one of history's greatest heroes. The year 777 brought with it whispers of opportunity that would change the fate of Europe. In the grand halls of Paderborn, where Charlemagne held court during the season Easter, an unexpected delegation arrived from across the Pyrenees. These were not ordinary envoys. They were Muslim rulers fleeing the iron grip of ar-Rahman, the Umayyad emir of Córdoba, whose power was spreading like wildfire across the Iberian Peninsula. Leading this desperate embassy was Sulayman ibn Yaqzan al-Arabi, the Wali of Zaragoza, a man whose very presence at a Christian court spoke of the desperation gripping northern Spain. Sulayman had come bearing promises that would make any king's pulse quicken. He spoke of cities ready to surrender, of treasures waiting to be claimed, of an entire region that would bow before Frankish might. Alongside him stood Abu Tahir of Huesca and al-Hussein ibn Yahya al-Ansuri of Barcelona, each ruler offering their own piece of the Spanish puzzle. Together, they painted a picture of easy conquest, of a land ripe for Christian liberation, of glory that would eclipse even Charlemagne's previous triumphs against the Saxons and Lombards. The great king listened with growing excitement. Here was a chance to extend Christendom beyond the natural barrier of the Pyrenees, to carve out a buffer zone against Muslim expansion, and perhaps most tempting of all, to claim the vast wealth that Spain's cities promised. Charlemagne's decision was swift and decisive. He would march south with the largest army he could muster, crossing the mountains that had stood as Europe's southern frontier since Roman times. So eager was he for this campaign that he forgot a prior commitment to Pope Hadrian, who had planned to stand as godfather at the baptism of one of Charlemagne's newly born sons. The winter months of 777 and early 778 buzzed with preparation. From every corner of the Frankish realm, the call to arms echoed through castle halls and monastery walls. This would be no ordinary raid. Charlemagne planned a massive two-pronged invasion that would crush any resistance before it could organize. The eastern column would include Austrasians, Lombards, and Burgundians, marching through Catalonia, where friendly Muslim rulers promised safe passage. The western column, led by Charlemagne himself, would sweep through Vasconia into the heart of the Spanish frontier. Notably absent were troops from Aquitaine, still recovering from the devastating wars that had brought that region under Frankish control a decade. As spring broke earlier, across the Frankish lands, the great army assembled. Men came from Burgundy with their long, speedy shield seers and paint Austrasian. Nobles rode south with retinues of mounted warriors, their mail gleaming in the morning Sunday. From Bavaria came hardened fighters who had learned warfare on the eastern frontiers. Provence and Septimania sent their contingents, and even the recently conquered Lombards provided troops for this holy endeavor. The sight of this host was magnificent, a river of steel and banners flowing toward the Pyrenees like an unstoppable tide. The crossing began in earnest as the snows melted from the mountain passes. Both columns moved with practiced precision, their scouts ranging ahead, their supply trains groaning under the weight of provisions and siege equipment. The eastern force found welcome in Barcelona and Girona, where Sulayman al-Arabi's allies opened their gates and provided guides for the march towards Zaragoza. Meanwhile, Charlemagne's western column swept through the Basque territories, Vasconia, a region nominally under Frankish control but fiercely protective of its ancient freedoms. The two armies converged before the walls of Zaragoza, like jaws of a massive trap. Here stood the prize that had been promised, the key to the entire Spanish frontier. The city's walls rose high above the Ebro River, its towers crowned with the banners of Islam, its gates sealed against the Christian host. Sulayman al-Arabi rode forward to speak with the city's defenders, confident that his promises fruit. But the political to Charlemagne would bear landscape of Muslim Spain, was as treacherous as the mountain passes the Franks had just crossed. Inside Zaragoza, a deadly game was already in motion. ar-Rahman of Córdoba had not been idle while the Franks marched south. His most trusted general, Thalaba ibn Ubayd, had arrived with gold and promises, working to turn the city's defenders against their former ally. Al-Hussein, who controlled Zaragoza's fate, found himself caught between the approaching Frankish army and the distant but powerful emir of Córdoba. The choice he made would seal the doom of many brave men in the mountains to come. When Sulayman al-Arabi approached the walls, expecting the gates to swing open in welcome, he instead found steel and defiance. Al-Hussein had made his decision. The promised surrender would not come. The easy conquest that had lured Charlemagne across the Pyrenees was nothing but smoke and mirrors. Instead of a triumphant entry, the Franks found themselves settling into the grinding routine of a siege, their supply lines stretching back across the mountains, their men growing restless under the Spanish Sunday. Days turned to weeks as the siege dragged on. Charlemagne's engineers built their towers, siege and battering rams, but Zaragoza's walls stood firm. The promised local support melted away like morning worse mist. Still, disturbing news filtered in from across the frontier. Saxon tribes were stirring in the north, threatening the very heartland of the Frankish realm. The king who had come seeking easy glory found himself trapped between an uncooperative city and growing threats at home. The breaking point came with shocking suddenness. Within Zaragoza's walls, the tensions between the Muslim rulers exploded into violence. Sulayman ibn Yaqzan al-Arabi, the man whose promises had started this entire campaign, was murdered by his own associate, Al-Hussein. The news struck the Frankish camp like a thunderbolt. Their primary ally was dead, their path to easy conquest had vanished, and their position was becoming precarious by more the day. With this catastrophe. Pharisaic turn of events, Charlemagne was forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. Al-Hussein, now in undisputed control of Zaragoza, offered a face-saving compromise. He would provide gold and release prisoners, including the captured general Ibn Ubayd, in exchange for the Franks' withdrawal. It was a bitter pill for the great emperor to swallow, but with his army's morale cracking and urgent business awaiting him in the north, Charlemagne accepted the deal. The retreat began in the late summer heat, a proud army now reduced to a column of frustrated warriors laden with whatever spoils they could claim. As they passed through Pamplona, the capital of the Basque territories, Charlemagne made a decision that would haunt him forever. Whether driven by rage at his failed campaign or a desire to ensure the Basques' continued submission, he ordered the city's walls to be destroyed. The ancient fortifications that had protected this Christian city for centuries were torn down, their stones scattered like broken teeth across the ground. This act of destruction sent shockwaves through the Basque population. They had watched the great Frankish army march south with hopes of conquest, only to return defeated and bitter. Now their own king, the man they had nominally accepted as overlord, was destroying their defenses and humiliating their proud city. The message was clear. Charlemagne would tolerate no dissent, no independence, no reminder of his failure in Spain. But the Basques were not a people to accept such treatment quietly. As the Frankish column wound its way through the narrow defiles leading to Roncevaux Pass, the mountain shadows seemed to whisper of coming doom. The terrain itself conspired against them, forcing thousands of men into a thin snake of steel and flesh that stretched for miles along the ancient Roman road. At the head of this procession rode Charlemagne himself, his mind already turning toward the Saxon wars that demanded his attention in the north. Behind him, the main body of the army pressed forward, eager to reach the familiar lands beyond the mountains. But at the rear, separated by distance and fate, came the baggage train and rearguard, under the command of Roland, Count of the Breton March. The Basques had not been idle during the days since Pamplona's walls fell. In the high valleys and hidden caves of their ancestral homeland, warriors gathered like storm clouds preparing to break. These were not the disciplined ranks of a royal army, far more dangerous. They but something free fighting ancient for their very identity. There were Mendums, their right to exist as free people in the land their fathers had defended since time immemorial. Every broken stone of Pamplona's walls had been a wound to their pride, every fallen tower a call to vengeance. The geography of Roncevaux Pass made Hemet the ground. The narrow valley, our perfect killing bin by towering peaks and dense forests, offered no room for the tactical maneuvers that had made Frankish armies invincible on the plains of Europe. Here, numbers meant nothing. Here, the advantage lay with those who knew every rock, every tree, every hidden path that wound through the mountain wilderness. The Basques had chosen their moment with the cunning of wolves selecting their prey. August the 15th dawned clear and bright, with no hint of the carnage to come. The Frankish vanguard pushed through the pass without incident, their banners bright against the morning sky. The main body followed, knights and infantry maintaining their formation even in the confined space. But as the day wore on and the shadows lengthened, the rearguard found itself increasingly isolated. The baggage train, heavy with theed that Ghul al-Hussein had paid to end the siege, moved slowly over the rough ground. Oxen sank their reined against yokes, wheels creaked on rocky paths, and the sound of their passage echoed between the mountain walls like a dinner bell calling predators to feast. Roland rode among his men with the easy confidence of a warrior who had never known defeat. At his side were some of the greatest names in Frankish nobility. Eggihard, the king's seneschal, whose wisdom had guided Charlemagne through countless campaigns. Anselm, the Count Palatine, whose courage was legend throughout the realm. These were not green recruits, but veterans who had carved their reputations in blood across a dozen battlefields. They commanded men who had stood in the shield wall against Saxon berserkers, who had stormed Lombard fortresses, who had never fled from any foe. Yet for all their skill and valor, they were about to face an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The attack came with the fury of an avalanche. As dusk began to gather in the mountain passes, the Basque warriors emerged from their hiding places like phantoms given flesh. They had waited with infinite patience, allowing the vanguard to pass, letting the main body move beyond supporting distance. Now, with the rearguard trapped in the narrow confines of the pass, they struck with devastating precision. War cries echoed from the peaks as hundreds of fighters descended from the heights, their weapons glinting in the dying light. The first volley came not from swords or spears, but from the mountains themselves. Boulders crashed down from the heights, crushing men and horses alike, turning the ordered column into chaos. The carefully maintained formation that was the backbone of Frankish military doctrine dissolved in moments as warriors scattered to avoid the deadly rain of stone. Horses reared and screamed, their riders fighting to maintain control as panic spread through the ranks like wildfire. But this was only the beginning. As the rockslide ended, the Basque fighters poured down from the mountainsides with weapons drawn. They moved with the fluid grace of men who had been born in these mountains, who knew every stone and tree as intimately as a lover knows their beloved's face. Against them, the heavily armored Franks found themselves at every disadvantage. Their mail and steel, so effective on open battlefields, became burdens in the confined space of the pass. Their long spears and cavalry swords, weapons designed for formation fighting, were clumsy in the close quarters combat that now raged among the rocks and trees. Roland's voice cut through the din as he rallied his men, trying to form some semblance of a defensive line. But the terrain worked against every tactical principle the Franks had learned. There was no room to charge, no space to deploy their superior numbers, no way to bring their military discipline to bear against an enemy that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. The Basques fought with the desperate fury of men defending their homeland, their families, their very existence as a free people. The battle that followed was less a clash of armies than a slaughter. The narrow pass became a charnel house as Frankish nobles fell beneath Basque spears and axes. The baggage train, loaded with the treasure that was supposed to compensate for the failed Spanish campaign, became the focus of a feeding frenzy as warriors stripped the dead and loaded their spoils onto captured pack animals. The gold that al-Hussein had paid to buy peace would now fund Basque resistance for generations to come. As the last light faded from the western sky, the sounds of battle gradually died away. The narrow valley that had echoed with war cries and clashing steel fell silent, except for the moans of the wounded and the distant howl of wolves drawn by the scent of blood. The Basque fighters, their vengeance complete, melted back into the mountains as suddenly as they had appeared. Behind them, they left a scene of utter devastation that would haunt the survivors' nightmares for years to come. When dawn broke over Roncevaux Pass, The full extent of the disaster became clear. The pride of Frankish nobility lay scattered across the rocky ground like broken dolls. Roland, the flower of chivalry, would never again lead his men into battle. Eggihard and Anselm, pillars of Charlemagne's court, had paid the ultimate price for their king's ambitions. The rearguard that had entered the pass 2,000 strong had been obliterated almost to the last man. News of the massacre reached Charlemagne as he made camp on the northern slopes of the Pyrenees. The reports came in fragments at first, confused accounts from scattered survivors who had stumbled the mountain bull through passes in the dark. A patrol missing, the rearguard overdue. Then the terrible truth began to emerge as wounded men limped into the Frankish camp, their mail torn and bloodied, their eyes hollow with the memory of what they had witnessed in that narrow valley of death. The great emperor who had conquered nations, who had never known the taste of defeat, stood silent as the full scope of the disaster unfolded before him. His most trusted commanders were gone. His nephew Roland, the golden prince of Frankish chivalry, lay cold among the rocks of Roncevaux. The treasure that was meant to salvage something from this failed campaign had vanished into the mountain strongholds of his enemies. In a single afternoon, the Basques had accomplished what no Saxon war chief, no Lombard duke, no Muslim emir had ever achieved. They had bloodied Charlemagne and lived to tell the tale. The king's rage was terrible to behold. Orders flew from his pavilion like arrows from a drawn bow. Scout parties were dispatched to hunt down the attackers. The army was turned about, its columns reforming for a punitive expedition that would wash the mountains in Basque blood. But even as his commanders rushed to obey, Charlemagne knew in his heart that vengeance would be hollow. The Basques had struck and vanished like ghosts, melting back into terrain they knew better than any foreign army ever could. They would not stand and fight where Frankish discipline could be brought to bear. They would fade into the high valleys and hidden caves, emerging only to strike again when the moment suited them. The pursuit that followed was a study in frustration. Frankish columns climbed treacherous mountain paths, their horses struggling on rocky ground that seemed designed to break legs and necks. They found burned villages and empty strongholds, signs of hasty evacuation but no enemies to fight. The Basques had learned the lesson of Roncevaux well. They would not give the Franks another chance to corner them in open battle. Instead, they became shadows in their own mountains, watching from high peaks as foreign soldiers stumbled through valleys that held nothing but wind and stone. After days of fruitless searching, Charlemagne was forced to accept bitter reality. The Saxon frontier was calling, demanding his immediate attention. Rebel tribes were gathering in the northern forests, threatening to undo years of conquest and conversion. Every day spent chasing Basque phantoms through the Pyrenees was a day his enemies to ar-Rahman strengthened their positions. With the taste of defeat still sharp in his mouth, the great emperor ordered his army to abandon the pursuit and march north toward the lands where his presence was truly needed. The journey back to Francia was unlike any Charlemagne had ever made. Gone was the triumphant progress of a conquering hero, replaced by the grim march of an army nursing its wounds. The men who had crossed the Pyrenees with songs on their lips now trudged northward in sullen silence. The banners that had flown so proudly in the Spanish sun hung limp and tattered in the mountain air. Even the weather seemed to mock them, with cold rains turning the roads to mud and mist, obscuring the familiar shoal landmarks that have marked their homecoming. Yet perhaps most troubling of all was the silence that settled over the disaster like a burial shroud. In the official records of the Frankish court, the massacre at Roncevaux simply did not exist. The royal annals spoke of a successful expedition to Spain, of hostages taken at Zaragoza, of the submission of the Basques. There was no mention of Roland's death, no accounting for the lost treasure, no acknowledgement that Charlemagne had suffered his first and only military defeat. The scribes wrote their careful lies with steady hands, creating a version of history that would serve their master's reputation better than the bloody truth. This conspiracy of silence extended throughout the Frankish nobility. Men who had lost brothers and sons in the mountain pass spoke of them as having died gloriously in Spain, but never specified where or how. Veterans of the campaign found themselves unable to discuss what they had witnessed, not from any formal prohibition, but from an understanding that certain truths were too dangerous to voice while their emperor still lived. The massacre became a ghost that haunted the Frankish court, present in every glance and gesture, but never acknowledged in word or deed. For more than 30 years, this silence held. Chronicles were written that made no mention of Roncevaux. Poets sang of Charlemagne's victories without noting his sole defeat. Even Eggihard, the emperor's closest friend and biographer, remained mute on the subject while his master drew breath. It was only after Charlemagne's death in 814 that the truth began to emerge, whispered at first in monastery scriptoriums and noble halls, then gradually finding its way into official records as a new generation of chroniclers felt safe enough to speak of what their predecessors had hidden. When Eggihard finally wrote his Life of Charlemagne, he chose his words with exquisite care. The great emperor, he wrote, had been ambushed in the Pyrenees by treacherous Basques who attacked from the heights while darkness fell. The rearguard had been annihilated, its commanders slain to the last man. Among the dead were Eggihard the Seneschal, Anselm the Count Palatine, and Roland, Lord of the Breton March. The baggage train had been plundered, the enemy had scattered in all directions, and the wound of this defeat had shadowed all of Charlemagne's Spanish successes. But even Eggihard's account, written decades after the fact, bore the marks of careful editing. The biographer spoke of the attack in general terms, avoiding the specific details that might reopen old wounds or embarrass surviving participants. He mentioned the loss of treasure, but not its staggering amount. He named the principal victims, but said nothing of the thousands of common soldiers who had died alongside their lords. Most tellingly, he offered no explanation for why the Basques had chosen to attack their nominal overlord, leaving readers this to assume was mere treachery rather than justify their revenge for destruction of Pam, as it Pamplona. The truth gradually emerged through other sources, painted a more complex picture. The Basques had not struck without provocation. Charlemagne's decision to destroy Pamplona's walls had been the spark that ignited their fury, the final insult that transformed submission into rebellion. The Christian king who claimed to fight for the faith had turned his weapons against fellow Christians, demolishing the defenses of a city that had never raised arms against him. In Basque eyes, this made him no different from any other foreign invader, no more deserving of loyalty than the Muslim emirs he claimed to oppose. The tactical brilliance of the ambush spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of both terrain and enemy. The Basques had waited for the perfect moment, allowing the main Frankish force to pass beyond supporting distance before striking at the vulnerable rearguard. They had used the geography of the pass to negate every advantage the Franks possessed, turning superior numbers and equipment into liabilities in the confined space between mountain walls. The timing of the attack, as darkness began to fall, prevented any organized Frankish response and ensured that survivors would struggle to give coherent accounts of what had transpired. Most impressive of all was the discipline shown by the Basque fighters in the aftermath of victory. Lesser warriors might have been tempted to pursue the fleeing Franks, to press their advantage while their enemies were demoralized and scattered. Instead, the Basques collected their spoils and vanished into the mountains, denying Charlemagne any opportunity for immediate retaliation. They understood that their victory lay not in destroying the entire Frankish army, which was impossible, but in inflicting maximum damage while preserving their own forces for future resistance. The gold and treasure captured at Roncevaux would fund Basque independence for generations to come. Muslim coins from Zaragoza found their way into mountain strongholds where they were melted down and reforged into weapons and ornaments. Frankish arms and armor were distributed among tribal warriors, improving their equipment for future conflicts. Most valuable of all was the psychological impact of the victory, proof that even the mightiest emperor could be bloodied by determined defenders fighting on their own ground. For the Basque people, Roncevaux represented something far more significant than a mere military success. It was validation of their ancient freedoms, confirmation that their mountain homeland could not be conquered by any foreign power. The warriors who had struck down Roland and his companions became heroes in their own communities, their names preserved in songs and stories that would be passed down through countless generations. The pass where they had won their greatest victory became a sacred site, a place of pilgrimage where future generations would come to remember the day their ancestors had humbled an emperor. But perhaps the most enduring consequence of Roncevaux was not felt in the Basque mountains or the Frankish court, but in the realm of memory and myth. The massacre that Charlemagne's chroniclers tried so desperately to hide would eventually become one of medieval Europe's most celebrated stories, though in a form that bore little resemblance to historical reality. The transformation of this bitter defeat into glorious legend would take centuries to complete, but its roots were planted in that moment when Roland drew his final breath among the rocks and pines of the Pyrenean Pass. The massacre at Roncevaux stands as one of history's most fascinating paradoxes, a crushing military defeat that would spawn one of literature's greatest heroes. A moment of Basque triumph that chroniclers tried desperately to erase, a single afternoon that shattered the myth of Charlemagne's invincibility, yet ultimately enhanced his legend through the courage of those who died in his service. In that narrow mountain pass, we witnessed the collision of two worlds. The ordered discipline of Frankish feudalism met the fierce independence of mountain warriors who would bow to no foreign king. Political ambition crashed against ancient freedoms. Imperial dreams died among the rocks and pines, yet from their ashes rose stories that would outlive empires. Roland's death at Roncevaux reminds us that history's most enduring legends often spring from its darkest hours. The massacre that Charlemagne's scribes refused to record became the foundation of medieval chivalric romance. The defeat that shadowed an emperor's reign gave birth to tales of heroism that still echo today. In the end, the Basque warriors who struck that day achieved something far greater than military victory. They created a legend that would prove more powerful than any army, more enduring than any crown.